Can you imagine? A dark secret lay buried for years, hidden beneath the seemingly idyllic look of family life. But when a local journalist uncovers a chilling tale of betrayal and murder, the truth comes crashing down, exposing a father's unimaginable crime, a son's tragic end, an affair with his stepmother, and a father's brutal reaction. In the small, tight-knit village of Belvoir, nestled deep in the hills of southern France, the shock of an unthinkable crime rattled the community to its very core. It was a crime so heinous, so unimaginable, that it would echo in the quiet streets and homes for generations. The tale unfolded on a rainy October evening, 2007, when one family's deep-rooted secrets finally came to light. Paul Moreau was a man whose quiet, reliable presence had never suggested the depths of the rage that simmered beneath the surface. A respected carpenter, he had built a life for his family, one founded on hard work and dedication. His wife, Isabelle, had been the anchor of their home, a nurturing figure who balanced the demands of running a household with an unwavering sense of duty. Together they raised their son, Michel, a quiet and studious young man who had always kept to himself, particularly as he entered his late teens. Michel, now 19, had inherited his father's stoic demeanor. He was an introverted young man who spent most of his time reading, fixing things around the house, and working on odd jobs in the village. His relationship with Isabelle, however, was not as innocent as it appeared. For months, there had been whispers, snippets of hushed conversations, and suspicious glances that something was wrong within the family, but no one could put their finger on it. The secret was carefully concealed, until the fateful night that would shatter everything. It was late when Paul returned home from a long day's work. The air was heavy with the scent of freshly cut wood and the dampness of the evening fog. Isabelle had been waiting for him in the kitchen as she always did, preparing a modest meal. Michel had retreated to his room, as was his routine, but there was a tension in the house that Paul could not shake. In the past, he had sensed the underlying strain between his wife and son, but he had never considered the possibility that something was amiss. He trusted them both implicitly. Isabelle, the woman he had loved since childhood, and Michel, his only son, the legacy of their union. That night, however, the truth would find its way to the surface. The discovery came not through confrontation or accusations, but rather through a letter. Paul had found it in the pocket of Michel's jacket. The letter was an innocuous piece of paper at first glance, but the words within shattered Paul's world. Isabelle had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. Michel had confessed his secret love for his stepmother. It was a relationship that began in the silence of their home and bloomed in the shadows of a twisted, forbidden bond. What had started as a simple glance, a moment of connection, soon escalated into something much darker. The revelation hit Paul like a slap to the face. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the betrayal, the agony of being deceived by the two people he trusted most. His world, once so stable and predictable, unraveled in an instant. The paper trembled in his hands as he read the words over and over, the sentences burning into his mind. The village had no idea of the storm that was brewing inside Paul. To them, he was still the dependable carpenter, the strong father, the man who had never shown signs of weakness. They had no clue of the turmoil he carried within, nor the vengeance that was slowly taking root in his heart. Paul had always believed that family was sacred. He had worked tirelessly to provide for them, to create a home where his son could grow up free from the struggles he himself had known. And now, Michel had not only destroyed that sense of security, but he had also torn apart the very fabric of their family's trust. For days, Paul stayed silent, his thoughts consumed by the betrayal. He could no longer look at Isabelle without seeing the woman who had betrayed him, nor could he face Michel without the searing image of the man who had slept with his mother. Every conversation, every glance between them, felt like an unbearable weight pressing down on his chest. Paul knew that something had to be done. Isabelle was oblivious to the storm that was coming. She went about her days as if nothing had changed, believing that Paul's silence was simply the result of his exhaustion from work. She had no idea that her husband's heart had turned cold, that the trust she had broken could never be repaired. Michel, too, remained unaware of the consequences of his actions. He had always assumed that his father's love for him was unconditional, that nothing could ever tear them apart. But in those final moments before everything would change, Michel was lost in his own world, never once realizing the extent of the damage he had caused. The morning of the incident dawned crisp and clear, the sun breaking through the clouds as if to signal the end of one life and the beginning of another. Paul woke early, his mind made up. He could no longer live in a world where his family's honor had been tarnished in such a monstrous way. That day, Paul decided to take matters into his own hands. The events that followed were swift and calculated. In the isolation of their farmhouse, far from the prying eyes of the village, Paul confronted Michel. It was a confrontation unlike any other, one that would be marked by violence, bloodshed, and the ultimate betrayal of a father's love. Paul led his son into the nearby woods, where the tall trees whispered secrets to the wind. The dense forest was far enough from the village that no one would hear the cries, the pleas, or the desperate struggle that was about to unfold. In those woods, Paul buried his son alive. He dug a shallow grave and forced Michel into it, the dirt quickly filling in around him as the young man's cries for mercy grew fainter with each passing moment. It was a brutal act, one that would haunt Paul for the rest of his life. But in his heart he felt justified. Michel had destroyed everything Paul had worked for, had betrayed the very foundation of their family. In that moment, as the dirt settled over his son's lifeless body, Paul believed he had done what was necessary. The news of Michel's disappearance spread quickly through the village, but no one suspected the truth. Paul maintained his composure, even as the police began their search. They questioned him, but he remained calm, his answers measured and controlled. The quiet grief of a father who had lost his son to the harsh realities of the world. The authorities never found Michel's body, and for years the village continued on, unaware of the crime that had been committed just outside their doors. But Paul would never forget. And Isabelle, though she had no idea of the depth of her husband's actions, would live with the knowledge of her own betrayal for the rest of her days. In the quiet of the night, when everywhere seemed still, Paul would sometimes hear the echoes of Michel's voice calling out to him, and in those moments, he knew that the weight of his decision would follow him until the end of his days. After the tragic events in the woods, life in Belvoir continued as it always had. The village, with its narrow cobbled streets and simple homes, was a place where people did not dwell on matters that did not concern them directly. Yet, despite the outward calm, something deep within the fabric of the community had changed. It wasn't immediately noticeable, but a shift had occurred, one that would take years to fully understand. For Paul Moreau, the days that followed Michel's death were filled with a haunting emptiness. He had always been a man of few words, but now, silence consumed him. The man who had once been seen as a pillar of the village was now a ghost walking through his own life, a mere shell of the man he had been before the tragedy. Paul spent most of his time in his workshop, carving and sanding wood. The rhythmic sound of his tools a distraction from the constant nagging in his mind. His hands had once crafted beautiful furniture, but now they only shaped pieces of wood with no real purpose, a silent reflection of his fractured soul. His wife Isabelle, who had been unaware of the dark truth until it was far too late, noticed the change in her husband, but she did not know how to approach him. For years they had shared a quiet bond, a marriage that had been built on mutual respect, love, and shared responsibilities. Now, Paul was a stranger to her. She no longer understood the man who sat across from her at the dinner table, his eyes empty and distant. At times, she tried to reach out, but Paul would withdraw further into himself, his responses curt, his moods unpredictable. She had no idea why the change had come about, but she could feel it, like a thick fog that would not lift. The villagers, too, were unaware of the truth behind Michel's disappearance. The Moreau family was well known in the area, and the sudden absence of their son stirred whispers, but nothing more. People assumed that Michel had simply gone off to explore the world, as young men often did. His disappearance was seen as a sad but natural part of life, a son leaving home to seek his own path. No one suspected that his life had been violently taken, buried in the woods just outside of the village, the secret hidden from their view. The police had, of course, conducted their own investigation, but their efforts led nowhere. Michel had been missing for weeks before the authorities were alerted, and by the time they started questioning Paul and Isabelle, any trace of the young man had long since disappeared. The fact that Paul had maintained his composure during the questioning only fueled the suspicion that perhaps he knew more than he was letting on. However, there were no signs of foul play, and without a body, the police could do little more than search the area and ask the usual questions. For months, the family tried to carry on as though life were normal. Isabelle continued with her chores, her work in the garden, and her visits to the market. But each day, as she walked through the village, she felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her. She could not shake the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had no proof, no solid foundation for her suspicions, but the tension between herself and Paul was palpable, and it was impossible to ignore. She started to wonder if her husband had known something all along, something that he wasn't telling her. Are you enjoying the documentary? Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. In the quiet of the night, Isabelle sometimes heard sounds from Paul's workshop. The scraping of wood, the whir of tools. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened to their son. Could he have truly disappeared without a trace? Was he out there somewhere, lost and alone? Or had something darker transpired, something that no one would ever be able to explain? Paul's life became an endless cycle of work, sleep, and silence. He avoided social gatherings and stayed away from the village pub where people would often gather to talk. The old friends who used to stop by his workshop now kept their distance, sensing that something was amiss, but unsure of what exactly had happened. Some whispered that Paul had been grieving his son's departure, while others murmured that the father had been involved in his disappearance, but no one dared ask directly. Everyone simply went on with their lives, and the Moreau family became an unspoken subject, something to be avoided. As the years passed, the memory of Michel began to fade, not in the hearts of his parents, but in the minds of the villagers. People moved on. New faces came and went, and the once vibrant young man who had been seen around town was no longer a topic of conversation. He had become a ghost, a part of the past that no one cared to revisit. The Moreau household, though, remained unchanged, the walls holding the silent grief of a father who had taken the life of his own flesh and blood. The burden on Paul grew heavier with each passing day. He was tormented by the actions he had taken, and though he tried to convince himself that what he had done was justified, there was a gnawing feeling of guilt that would not leave him. The memory of Michel's desperate cries, the sound of his son's voice fading into the dirt, haunted Paul's every waking moment. He knew, deep down, that there would be no escaping the consequences of his actions. Despite the weight of his guilt, Paul never confessed. He never sought redemption. He continued to live in Belvoir, never leaving the village, and tried to avoid any situation that might force him to confront his crime. The walls of his home became a prison, and the life he once knew became a series of hollow motions, each day passing in a blur of regret and self. It wasn't until many years later, in 2012, when the truth about Michel's fate would finally come to light. By then, Paul had become an aging man, his hair graying, his back bent from years of hard work. Isabelle had passed away, her death a quiet affair that had taken few by surprise. She had never truly understood what had happened to Michel, but in her final years she had grown distant, her own mind failing her. Paul, now alone, lived with his guilt, and the secret that had weighed so heavily on him for so long would soon be uncovered, not by the police, but by someone who had come to the village, unaware of the horrors that had transpired years before. One fateful afternoon, as Paul walked through the woods near the farmhouse, he came across a weathered stone, partially buried beneath a pile of leaves. It was a small marker, barely noticeable, but it stopped him in his tracks. The stone had been placed there long ago, a silent reminder of the life he had taken, the life that would never be forgotten. The secret had not stayed hidden forever. And in the quiet aftermath, Paul knew that the consequences of his actions would eventually catch up with him. As the years passed, the village of Belvoir returned to its regular rhythm, though a few individuals could not completely shake off the unsettling memory of Michelle's disappearance. The police had long abandoned their investigation, considering it an unsolved case. The townspeople, in their curiosity, never questioned the absence of answers. They simply moved on with their own lives. But for one outsider, the unsettling mystery never quite faded. In 2012, an ambitious young journalist named Claire Dupont moved to the region. Originally from Paris, she had arrived to cover a local story on rural life in the south of France. Claire had a keen interest in unsolved mysteries and true crime, and her intuition often led her to stories that others overlooked. Though she initially came to write about the quiet charm of Belvoir, it wasn't long before she began to uncover whispers of a much darker story buried beneath the surface of the idyllic village. The more Claire interacted with the people of Belvoir, the more she began to notice that Michelle's name still lingered in hushed conversations. At first, the villagers dismissed her inquiries, clearly uncomfortable with the subject. But as a persistent journalist, Claire pushed deeper, becoming a fixture in the local pubs and cafes, engaging with people who had lived in the village for decades. She pieced together snippets of conversations, half-remembered anecdotes, and lingering unease. There was a story here, a forgotten tragedy, and Claire was determined to uncover it. One afternoon, during a casual conversation with an elderly woman named Yvette, Claire learned that the Moreau family had been the subject of intense gossip many years ago. Yvette had lived in the village for most of her life and had seen the events unfold, though she had never spoken about them publicly. She hinted at something terrible, something about Paul and his son Michel, but was reluctant to elaborate. Claire's curiosity was piqued, and she pressed Yvette further. Reluctantly, Yvette told her that Michel had been a lively, charming young man, full of promise. He had been a popular figure in the village before his sudden disappearance. Everyone had assumed he had left to travel, but the villagers hadn't seen or heard from him in over a year. Then, shortly after his disappearance, Paul had become a shadow of the man he once was. Silent, withdrawn, and increasingly distant from his wife Isabelle. Yvette mentioned how Isabelle had been inconsolable, but even she hadn't known why Michel had vanished. Claire left the conversation with more questions than answers, but something had shifted. There was a deeper layer to the story, one that hinted at betrayal, deceit, and perhaps even murder. She could feel it in her bones, as if the walls of the village were closing in on her. Determined to learn more, Claire dug into the Moreau family's history. Her persistence led her to the local records, where she uncovered details that had been buried over the years. In the village archives, she found old newspaper clippings about Michel's disappearance. The reports were sparse, offering little information, but one article stood out. It was dated June 14, 1994, and it detailed the disappearance of a young man named Michel Moreau, a beloved member of the community. The article mentioned that the police had investigated the family, but had been unable to find any concrete evidence of foul play. It struck Claire as odd that, given the lack of any real investigation, no one had ever looked into the possibility that Michel's disappearance had been more sinister than anyone had realized. But it was the next clue that would truly send Claire down a dark path. During her research, she learned that the Moreau family had recently moved into a new house, a property just outside of the village. The house had been abandoned for years and was known for being haunted by some of the locals. Intrigued, Claire decided to visit the property herself, hoping to find something, anything, that could shed light on what had happened to Michel. The house sat atop a small hill, surrounded by dense trees and an overgrown garden. It looked almost forgotten, as though nature itself had slowly reclaimed the land. Claire was not deterred. She had already visited several abandoned properties for her stories and had become accustomed to the eerie silence that came with such places. The house was no different. Its windows were boarded up, and the once vibrant paint had faded, leaving the walls cracked and peeling. Claire felt a shiver run down her spine as she approached the front door. There was no one in sight, and the area felt desolate. The front door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping inside the dark, musty hallway. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost oppressive. She moved cautiously, exploring the rooms, hoping to find something that would give her a better understanding of the Moreau family's past. The place felt strangely cold, despite the warmth of the summer day outside. As Claire made her way through the house, she came across a locked door at the end of a narrow corridor. It was an odd thing to find in such a neglected house, and her curiosity was piqued. She pulled at the doorknob, but the door remained stubbornly shut. She looked around for anything that could serve as a key, and noticed an old wooden chest tucked in the corner of a nearby room. It was dusty, its surface scratched and worn, but Claire knew that whatever it contained could hold the answers she was searching for. Inside the chest, she found a stack of old journals belonging to Paul Moreau. Claire's hands trembled as she carefully flipped through the yellowed pages. The entries were dated, some going back as far as the early 1980s. As she read through the journals, Claire discovered fragments of Paul's inner thoughts, regret, and a deep-seated fear. His writings were incoherent at times, but there was one consistent theme: his son, Michel, and his troubled relationship with Isabelle, his second wife. It became clear that Paul's relationship with Michel had deteriorated over the years, filled with tension and anger. The journals suggested that Michel had become involved with Isabelle in a way that Paul had not been able to comprehend or accept. The young man's behavior had become erratic, and Paul's feelings of betrayal had festered, leading to a violent and tragic conclusion. The final entry in the journal was particularly chilling. It was dated March 23, 1994, the last known day anyone had seen Michel alive. The entry read, "I did what had to be done. There was no other choice. He betrayed me, and he betrayed us. No one will ever know the truth." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the reality of what she had uncovered hit her like a brick. Paul Moreau had killed his own son and buried him in the woods. The truth that had remained hidden for so long was finally exposed, and Claire knew she had to share it with the world. The tragedy of Belvoir was no longer a forgotten mystery. It was a chilling tale that would change everything for those who had once been content to let it fade into history. As Claire left the abandoned house, she knew that her investigation was far from over. She would bring the truth to light, but the cost of doing so was not yet clear. The quiet village of Belvoir would never be the same again, and neither would Paul Moreau, whose actions would soon be known to all. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Belvoir, a village that had long since buried its darkest secret, was once again thrust into the spotlight. Claire Dupont's article, published in the national papers, detailed the horrifying truth of Michel Moreau's disappearance, and soon the small town was overwhelmed by journalists, investigators, and curious onlookers, all eager to learn more. The once peaceful streets of Belvoir became chaotic. What had once been a quiet, forgotten tragedy now drew the attention of people from all over the country. The villagers were forced to confront their memories of Michel, and many were horrified to learn the truth behind his disappearance. Old wounds were reopened, and the townspeople struggled to reconcile their image of the Moreau family with the unspeakable crime that had been committed in their midst. For Paul Moreau, the truth was an inescapable reality. The old man, who had once been the figure of authority in the village, was now a pariah. His life, which had once seemed so simple and unremarkable, had been shattered by the revelation of his darkest actions. Paul had spent the years since Michel's death in relative isolation, a man haunted by guilt and regret, but now his sins were out in the open for all to see. He was arrested shortly after Claire's article was published, the evidence too overwhelming to deny. The journals she had found in the abandoned house had provided the final piece of the puzzle. During his interrogation, Paul remained eerily calm, though his face betrayed the inner torment he had carried for years. He confessed to his son's murder, his voice trembling as he recounted the events of that fateful night. The betrayal he felt from Michel was too much to bear, he explained. It wasn't just the affair with Isabelle. It was the feeling that his son had become someone he no longer recognized. He spoke of his growing paranoia, his sense of powerlessness, and how, in a moment of rage, he had made the decision that would change everything. In the weeks that followed, the investigation revealed even more disturbing details. Isabelle, Michel's stepmother, had been complicit in the crime, though her involvement was not as direct. It became clear that she, too, had been involved in an illicit relationship with her stepson, one that had been kept secret for years. Isabelle had kept silent about Michel's affair with her for fear of exposing her own dark secret, but it was eventually revealed that she had known about Paul's intentions and had done nothing to stop him. In her own twisted way, she had become an accomplice to the crime, enabling Paul's actions by turning a blind eye to the growing tension in their household. The trial that followed was nothing short of a spectacle. The courtroom was packed with reporters, locals, and curious spectators who were eager to witness the downfall of the Moreau family. The defense team argued that Paul had been suffering from a mental breakdown, the product of years of stress, betrayal, and emotional instability, but the prosecution painted a different picture. One of a man who had calculated his son's murder, driven not by mental illness, but by an overwhelming sense of possession and control. In the end, the jury found Paul guilty of second-degree murder, sentencing him to 20 years in prison. Isabelle, on the other hand, was given a lesser sentence. She was charged with accessory to murder, but due to her lack of direct involvement in the killing, her sentence was much shorter. She was sentenced to 7 years in prison, but her punishment was not just legal. The public's opinion of her was nothing short of scorn. In the eyes of the village and the wider community, Isabelle had been as guilty as Paul, if not more so. Her betrayal, in the minds of many, had been just as unforgivable as his. In the months that followed, Belvoir slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy, though it was a new kind of normal. The once close-knit community now carried the weight of its darkest secret on its shoulders. People whispered about the Moreaus in hushed tones, and no one could escape the stain of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. The village had never truly known the truth, and now that it was exposed, there was no way to unsee it. The Moreau family's name would forever be synonymous with the worst kind of betrayal. For Claire Dupont, the exposure of the truth was both a triumph and a burden. She had uncovered the story that no one else had been brave enough to pursue, but in doing so, she had irrevocably changed the lives of everyone involved. The people of Belvoir would never forgive her for revealing the truth, but Claire knew that sometimes the truth had to be told, no matter how painful or uncomfortable it might be. Her role in unearthing the secrets of the Moreau family had been difficult, but she had done what she felt was right. As for the Moreau family, their lives were shattered. Paul would serve his sentence in prison, where he would likely face the same kind of isolation and torment that had haunted him before his arrest. Isabelle would eventually be released from prison, though she would never be able to escape the shame and stigma attached to her name. The world would always see her as complicit in the crime, and the memory of her actions would linger far longer than any prison sentence. The impact of the tragedy extended far beyond the Moreau family. The community of Belvoir would never be the same. It was a place where trust had been broken, where the unspoken boundaries of family had been shattered by the most unimaginable act. Michel's memory would forever be tainted by his father's actions, and the villagers would forever carry the weight of the knowledge that, sometimes, the most terrible secrets are hidden in plain sight. For Claire Dupont, the story was far from over. The aftermath of her investigation would linger in her mind for years to come, a haunting reminder of the cost of uncovering the truth. She had exposed the darkness within Belvoir, but, in doing so, she had also opened a door that could never be closed. And though the story of the Moreau family had come to an end, its legacy would remain forever etched in the village's history. What would you do if you discovered the darkest secrets of the people closest to you? How far would you go to protect your own twisted version of justice? The truth can be a dangerous thing. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to uncover more shocking real-life mysteries, subscribe now to never miss a jaw-dropping twist.